that okay? Is that okay? The 18th century was replete with a number of notorious celebrities, but there was one figure who towered above all of them, who accrued about himself a mythology more bizarre and contradictory than any others. And his name was Count Alessandro di Cagliostro. Depending on who you ask, Cagliostro was either an English spy, a Jesuit priest, a Neapolitan coachman, or a Portuguese Jew. Or perhaps he was the illegitimate son of an Arabian prince, an Egyptian raised in the pyramids, or an amphibian born of the foam of the seas. Some considered him a prophet, a demigod even, come to earth to heal the world's fractured religions. Others considered him a heretic, the wandering Jew, the Antichrist. It was disputed whether he was actually 5,000 years old or could simply travel through time so that he could witness Alexander the Great fight in battle. Could he commune with Socrates and Caesar? Could he turn hemp to silk and base metal to gold? Did he fly through the air on the wings of angels? Well, all of these things were claimed about Cagliostro, but the story begins in 1743 in a slum in Palermo with a boy named Giuseppe Balsamo. Giuseppe was something of a tearaway. He mugged his own uncle. He allegedly stabbed the local priest to death, but everyone was too scared to testify against him, and he was thrown out of school for intoning a litany of the local prostitutes during Mass. But he nonetheless managed to obtain a decent education, and he had a lifelong interest in chemistry and all sorts of esoteric knowledge in alchemy, in astrology, in Neoplatonic philosophy. He's forced to leave Palermo when he's involved in a robbery that goes wrong, and he ships up in Rome, where he becomes a secretary to a cardinal. But Giuseppe misses the patter of the marketplace, so he spends most of his time selling face cream made out of salad leaves and remarkably convincing knockoffs of old masters. In fact, when Casanova meets him, he considers Giuseppe's Rembrandts to be better than the originals. In Rome, Giuseppe also meets a beautiful, illiterate 14-year-old called Lorenza Feliciani, whom he marries. They move into Lorenza's parents' house, but they soon find the Feliciani's piety stultifying. So they hit the road and embark on a kind of vagabond grand tour across the continent of Europe. Everywhere they go, their modus operandi is more or less the same. They pretend to be aristocrats. Lorenza has now changed her name to the more grandiloquent Serafina, and she will insinuate herself into the bed of a local nobleman, while Giuseppe heavily hints that he's willing to overlook his wife's infidelity if a post could be found for him as an artist or an apothecary. In 1776, they show up in London, and this is significant for two reasons. It's the first time that Giuseppe calls himself Count Cagliostro, and he is also inducted as a Freemason. This takes place in a room above a pub in Jerwood Street. He is blindfolded, trussed up, raised on a pulley, which someone accidentally drops, and given a gun loaded only with powder, which he's forced to fire against his forehead. Now, in many ways, Freemasonry was a perfectly respectable institution. Freemasons did charitable works, they advocated free speech, the disinterested spread of knowledge, and the general doing of good things to mankind. If you were an upwardly mobile 18th century gentleman, joining the Freemasons was a little like joining a Rotary Club. At the same time, there was a Dan Brownish layer of arcana involving Knights Templar and sacred geometry and Rosicrucians, which appealed to a certain kind of man. And Cagliostro was that kind of man. He decided that he didn't really just want to be a Mason, he wanted to found his own branch of Masonry. So he claims that in a Soho bookshop, he discovers an ancient Egyptian manuscript containing sacred knowledge long lost to mankind, handed down from a shadowy figure called the Great Copt, or the Great Copt. And he uses this to establish his own right, and he hopes to achieve nothing less than the moral regeneration of mankind. In this, he's actually fairly successful, not in the moral regeneration perhaps, but in establishing his own right. He's a charismatic figure. He's got a swarthy complexion, so he looks like he's from the Orient. He ties his hair back in a single dreadlock. He prattles away in French and Italian and what he claims to be Arabic, and his voice, it was said, sounded like a trumpet muted by a crepe veil. But he is also a showman. He puts on seances, he performs telegnosis using child mediums, predicting what's happening hundreds of miles away, and he invents a number of rituals and practices to go along with his Egyptian rite. My favorite being a therapy for the physical regeneration of use that is so severe it makes the 5-2 diet look like a gourmand's wet dream. What you had to do was go to the forest for weeks on end, survive entirely on grass and water until your hair fell out, your teeth fell out, and all your skin peeled off. And then you're as good as new. Everywhere they went, the Cagliostros gained followers. They founded lodges. They took over existing ones. In The Hague, they were greeted by the masons who lined the streets with an arch of steel from their swords. In Courland, which is in modern-day Latvia, the local residents were so enamored with Cagliostro, they asked him to be their duke. And in St. Petersburg, he allegedly cured cancer sufferers using only his special distilled water, which was comprised entirely of water. But infuriated Catherine the Great so much that she was compelled to write not one, but 2 plays denouncing him. In 1781, Cagliostro comes to Strasbourg, where he has a fateful meeting with someone called the Cardinal de Rohan. Rohan is the Prince Bishop of Strasbourg. He's the scion of one of the most distinguished noble dynasties in France. He is Grand Almoner of France, which is the equivalent of Archbishop of Canterbury, and he becomes utterly besotted by Cagliostro. He thinks that he is a near god, and he begs him to move into his palace and offers him a laboratory into which he can conduct all sorts of experiments into the Philosopher's Stone, into the elixir of youth, into fattening small diamonds into bigger diamonds. And after a bit of umming and ahhing, Cagliostro agrees, though because he's established a reputation as an ascetic kind of guy, he very ostentatiously insists on sleeping only on the cardinal's sofa and subsisting entirely on cheese. At this point, everything seems to be going cushy. He's got a patron, he's got a Europe-wide reputation, but Cagliostro does not reckon that he is going to get involved in one of the great cause célèbre of the 18th century, the diamond necklace affair. Now, despite Rohan's considerable advantages and achievements, he was a man of frustrated ambition. Earlier on in his career, he had mortally offended Marie Antoinette. She no longer spoke to him, and he believed that her enmity was the only thing that stood between him and becoming chief minister. So he was very glad to meet a woman called Jeanne, Comtesse de la Motte-Valois, who claimed to be best friends with the Queen. And she said that she would intervene on his behalf and hopefully broker a reconciliation. Jeanne says that the cardinal can write a letter of apology, which he does, and there begins a long correspondence of increasing ardor between Rohan and the person whom he thinks is the Queen. In fact, Jeanne has never met the Queen, and she and her lover are forging the letters. Once the cardinal has been thoroughly beguiled, they ask him to buy one of the most expensive pieces of jewelry in Europe. It's a necklace of 2,800 carats. It has 647 stones. It's so heavy, it requires 2 counterweights running down the back to stop the wearer toppling over. And he says, great, I'll do that. So he obtains the necklace from the jewelers, hands it over to Jeanne, and she, her husband, and her lover break up the stones and flog them. Anyway, this scam unravels. Marie Antoinette finds out about it. She is furious. Rohan is arrested. Jeanne is arrested. And Cagliostro is arrested. First, because of his association with Rohan, and secondly, because Jeanne sees him as the most obvious scapegoat. For a start, he's a dodgy foreigner. He's living in a beautifully well-appointed house in the Marais, and no one knows where his money comes from. And Jeanne says he presided over a Black Sabbath in which he swore her and her husband to secrecy and presented them with a box full of loose diamonds and ordered them to sell them in England. So Cagliostro is arrested with Serafina. They are taken to the Bastille and they're separated for months on end. And this sends Cagliostro into a deep despair to such an extent that he's put on suicide watch. After 9 months and a lengthy investigation and trial, Cagliostro is acquitted. Unfortunately, the French king does not have such a favourable opinion of him, and he banishes him forever from France. Cagliostro comes to England. Again, he's in London. He is feted by the liberal elite as a celebrity, as a survivor of a vicious tyranny. Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, comes to visit him. The king's children comes to visit him. And he also meets somebody called Charles Thévenot de Morand. Now, Morand is the most scurrilous Frenchman in a city full of scurrilous Frenchmen. He started his life as a rent boy. He then went on to become a blackmailer, a French spy, before coming to London, setting up a very successful expatriate newspaper called the Courrier de l'Europe, into which he would encode his intelligence that he was sending back to France and pick fights with whomever he wanted. At first, Morand acts very friendly towards Cagliostro, but when Cagliostro refuses to pay the money needed to guarantee favourable coverage, Morand turns against him. So he muckrakes, he speaks to former associates of Cagliostro who denounce him as a fake and a fraud, and he mocks Cagliostro's more absurd pronouncements, one of which was that when he was growing up in Arabia, he used to feed his livestock on fodder laced with arsenic so that tigers who came to eat them would themselves be poisoned. Quite how the cows and the sheep were to survive is very unclear. In response to this, Cagliostro challenges Morand to one of the strangest duels ever. The weapon of choice is poisoned pork. And he writes this in the newspaper, the Public Advertiser. He says, "I will furnish a little sucking pig, fattened according to my own method. The day after this dinner, one of four things will happen. Either we will both be dead, or neither of us will be dead, or I will be dead and you will not, or you will be dead and I will not. Of these four chances, I will give you 3 and bet you 5,000 guineas that the day after the meal, you will be dead and I will be well." Again, he hasn't thought this through very clearly, because if Morand is dead, how is he going to claim the 5,000 guineas? The point is rendered moot because Morand declines the challenge, continues to harass Cagliostro to the point that he's driven out of the kingdom. By this stage, Cagliostro is a very ill man. He's suffering the effects of tertiary syphilis, which are slowly sending him insane, and his wife is very keen to return to her family in Rome. The only problem is the Catholic Church considers Freemasonry to be the work of the devil. But they receive reassurances that they will be allowed to return as long as they keep their heads below the parapet and don't engage in any Masonic activity. They return to Rome, and 3 months after they arrive there, Cagliostro is arrested by the Italian Inquisition. It turns out that the person who has denounced him is his own wife, who can no longer bear his rages and lunatic episodes. She actually soaped the stairs of their flat in the hope that he would slip down them and break his neck. The Inquisition treat Cagliostro as one of the most dangerous men who has ever fallen into their possession. There is an investigation that lasts again over a year. The Pope himself supervises aspects of it, and there is a lengthy charge sheet which includes all sorts of things, including idolatry, heresy, prostituting his wife, celebrating the French Revolution, and demanding that his penis be worshipped as a holy relic. He is unsurprisingly found guilty. He's sentenced to death, but as his head lies upon the block, the sentence is commuted to life imprisonment. And he's taken away to the castle of San Lorenzo in Urbino, which is on a cliff face 700 meters above the ground. And there he dies in 1795 in a shit-smeared cell, out of his mind, and a far cry from the man who was once the most celebrated in Europe. Now, in many ways, Cagliostro was a ludicrous and bombastic figure, and that was recognized by many of his contemporaries. But he also tapped into something of the spirit of the times, one which yearned after transcendence and magic, even in a century of increasing enlightenment and rationality. Shortly after he leaves France at the end of the Diamond Necklace affair and comes to London, he writes an open letter to the French people in which he denounces his treatment at the hands of the French and the viciousness with which he was dealt with. And towards the end of this letter, he looks to the future and hopes for a happy revolution that will bring about a democratic Senate and that will guarantee the liberties of the French people. And he writes, "Someone asked me whether I should return to France. Assuredly, I replied, provided the Bastille became a public promenade." Now, in 1786, when Cagliostro wrote this, no one, not even the most ardent Republican, foresaw that within a decade the Bastille would no longer be a prison and the French would have executed their king and queen. Ludicrous though he may have been, Cagliostro was also more prophetic than perhaps even he realized. Thank you.